Hello and welcome back to the Bookshelf Odyssey. What I want to talk about today is A Christmas Carol. Again, if you're new here, I host the Bookshelf Odyssey podcast as well as the Cozy Christmas podcast. And on both of those, I talk about Charles Dickens a lot, and especially A Christmas Carol. This is probably my all-time favorite book, not just Christmas book, but all-time favorite book. You're probably very familiar with the story. If you haven't read it, you have likely seen an adaptation of it. If you haven't seen an adaptation of it, you have seen it influenced in TV shows, movies, I mean, everything. It tells the story of Ebenezer Scrooge, who is a bit of a miser. He hates Christmas and people in general. And three ghosts visit him, the ghosts of Christmas past, present, and future, to try to help him change his ways, with the ghostly warning first given by his deceased partner, Jacob Marley, and just a fantastically frightening scene in this book. I first came across this story, obviously as a kid. I would watch Mickey's Christmas Carol, was probably my first introduction to this story, which is a beautiful little short film that I think still holds up today. And I think the first live adaptation version I saw was on the Alistair Sim version. It came out in 1951, and it still is one I enjoy watching at Christmas time. But as a teenager, I decided I hadn't actually read the story, and I thought I would try it out. I had been trying out Dickens and kind of liking him, but not sure if I could get through the story. So some of his stories were quite difficult, but this is a great entry into Dickens's novels. Not only is it because the story is so familiar to us, it's very easy to read. It's a good entry level into Victorian literature. Plus, there are so many beautiful additions made. I mean, look at even on the back of this cover, it's just gorgeous. I got a copy and I read it, and it changed my life. The ending, it left me in tears. You cheer with Ebenezer as he learns his lessons, and you cry with him as he weeps over people like Tiny Tim and in characters like that. You laugh with characters like the Fezziwigs, and I don't know. It is such a good book, and it has powerful moments in the story. And so what I want to do is just read this entire book to you, but I don't have time. But if you go to my Cozy Christmas podcast channel, I did read it one year on the podcast, and you can find those videos on my Cozy Christmas podcast channel, and I'll have the links below. This is a lovely story. Oh, I guess I should add in my journey with it. Back in 2012, I think it was, I had the opportunity to see Gerald Dickens perform a one-man show of A Christmas Carol. He's the great-great-grandson of Charles Dickens. Charles Dickens used to do one-man versions of A Christmas Carol, and so Gerald is continuing on the tradition of his great-great-grandfather, and it's a fantastic performance. If you ever have a chance to see him, he's touring in the United States right now, but he'll tour in the UK as well. And so I want to tell you, if you get a chance, go and see him. I also had a chance to interview him for my podcast, for the Cozy Christmas podcast, and you can find those links down below. So needless to say, this book has changed my life. The things that it teaches are lessons that I have tried to adapt into my own life. And I want to share with you some of quotes that have meant the most to me. Marley was dead, to begin with. There is no doubt whatever about that. The register of his burial was signed by the clergyman, the clerk, the undertaker, and the chief mourner. Scrooge signed it, and Scrooge's name was good upon change for anything he chose to put his hand to. Old Marley was as dead as a doornail. Mind, I don't mean to say that I know, of my own knowledge, what there is particularly dead about a doornail. I might have been inclined myself to regard a coffin nail as the deadest piece of ironmongery in the trade. But the wisdom of our ancestors is in the simile, and my unhallowed hands shall not disturb it, or the country's done for. You will therefore permit me to repeat emphatically that Marley was as dead as a doornail. Scrooge knew he was dead, Of course he did. How could it be otherwise? Scrooge and he were partners for I don't know how many years. Scrooge was his sole executor, his sole administrator, his sole assign, his sole residuary legatee, his sole friend, and sole mourner. And even Scrooge was not so dreadfully cut up by the sad event, but that he was an excellent man of business on the very day of the funeral, and solemnized it with an undoubted bargain. The mention of Marley's funeral brings me back to the point I started from. There is no doubt that Marley was dead. This must be distinctly understood, or nothing wonderful can come of the story I am going to relate. If we were not perfectly convinced that Hamlet's father died before the play began, there would be nothing more remarkable in his taking a stroll at night, in an easterly wind, upon his own ramparts, than there would be in any other middle-aged gentleman rashly turning out after dark in a breezy spot, say St. Paul's churchyard, for instance, literally to astonish his son's weak mind. Scrooge never painted out old Marley's name. There it stood years afterwards, above that warehouse door, Scrooge and Marley. The firm was known as Scrooge and Marley. Sometimes people new to the business called Scrooge Scrooge, and sometimes Marley, but he answered to both names. It was all the same to him. Oh, but he was a tight-fisted hand at the grindstone, Scrooge. A squeezing, wrenching, grasping, scraping, clutching, covetous old sinner, hard and sharp as flint, from which no steel had ever struck out generous fire, secret and self-contained, and solitary as an oyster. The cold within him froze his old features, nipped his pointed nose, shriveled his cheek, stiffened his gait, made his eyes red, his thin lips blue, and spoke out shrewdly in his grating voice. A frosty rime was on his head, and on his eyebrows and his wiry chin. He carried his own low temperature always about with him. He iced his office in the dog days and didn't thaw it 1 degree at Christmas. External heat and cold had little influence on Scrooge. No warmth could warm, nor wintry weather chill him. No wind that blew was bitterer than he. No falling snow was more intent upon its purpose. No pelting rain less open to entreaty. Foul weather didn't know where to have him. The heaviest rain and snow and hail and sleet could boast of the advantage over him in only one respect. They often came down handsomely, and Scrooge never did. Nobody ever stopped him in the street to say with gladsome looks, "My dear Scrooge, how are you? When will you come to see me?" No beggars implored him to bestow a trifle. No children asked him what it was o'clock. No man or woman ever once in all his life inquired the way to such and such a place of Scrooge. Even the blind men's dog appeared to know him, and when they saw him coming on, would tug their owners into doorways and up courts, and then would wag their tails as though they said, "No eye at all is better than an evil eye, dark master." But what did Scrooge care? It was the very thing he liked, to edge his way along the crowded paths of life, warning all human sympathy to keep its distance, was what the knowing ones call nuts to Scrooge. Once upon a time, of all the good days in the year, on Christmas Eve, old Scrooge sat busy in his counting house. Oh, I could just keep reading, but I would end up reading the whole book. I love that opening, the descriptions of Scrooge. It's so vivid, so descriptive and graphic. I love it. One other quote I just want to share. It's a quick one. At the end of in the Christmas present, when Scrooge sees Tiny Tim in the Cratchit's house, and that closing quote about the family, that how simple their celebrations were. But he says this, that there is nothing of high mark in this. They were not a handsome family. They were not well dressed. Their shoes were far from being waterproofed. Their clothes were scanty, and Peter might have known, and very likely did, the inside of a pawnbroker's. But they were happy, grateful, pleased with one another, and contented with the time. And when they faded and looked happier yet in the bright sprinklings of the Spirit's torch at parting, Scrooge had his eye upon them, and especially on Tiny Tim, until the last. So yeah, I love that description of the Cratchit family, and how, though they had little, they had much, because they had each other. and they had love. And that is one of the powerful elements of the story that takes it beyond just a cozy holiday read, that this book can profoundly affect and change your life. So let me encourage you to pick up this book and read it this year if you've never read it before. It is well worth the time you put into it. There are some excellent audiobook editions as well. You can find some great copies of this. And I'm just going to put this out in the universe. I want Richard Armitage to do a reading of A Christmas Carol. I think he'd be really good at it. I love his, I think it's Great Expectations he does. No, he did David Copperfield. That's what it was. A good recording. So yeah, I'm going to put that out there. Please do it. But yeah, read A Christmas Carol, watch a movie, make yourself comfortable and cozy. If you want me to read it to you, check out the links below, and you can listen on my Cozy Christmas podcast channel. I read the whole story over the space of, I think it was 4 or 5 episodes. So tomorrow, make sure you go over to Sarah's channel. She's at the Bookish Knitter, and she'll have our next entry in this Christmas Advent calendar. And I've really enjoyed participating. I'm sure I'm enjoying watching the videos you all have put out. Until next time, I want to encourage you to remember to honor Christmas in your heart and try to keep it all the year. And have a very Merry Christmas.